installs. It's actually just that easy when it comes to a twin spark, because it's a narrow head. The twin spark header actually falls in place a little bit easier than most. This is our own design. We've proven it time and time again that this is a better performing exhaust than most. So we tend to use it on any of our upgraded cars as an absolute. As you may or may not know, we have 3 different types of headers that we make. We make one for 1600 and 1750, which by design needs to be different than a 2-liter for performance applications. Then we make one for higher performing 2 liters. And then we make one for twin sparks that fits the 75 and the 155 head. Because this car is just flat out going to be a high performing car, it would be foolish to run a less than high performance header. Why hold it back, right? Anyhow, so we're just clicking along on this one. There's your update. Okay, so this is a twin spark 75 we've had sitting around for a very long time. And we're getting ready to tie it in. Now we're running carburetors on this, but we're still running a fairly advanced ignition system on it, which requires a throttle positioning sensor and a few other things in order for the coil packs to trigger off correctly. Now with that said, I'm getting ready. We had to cut the wires off in order not to have a gigantic hole coming through the firewall. So now what we're doing is we're going to solder back on the terminals for the throttle positioning sensor and the other sensor down below. Plus, we're going to be bringing in the wiring to activate the active coil pack. So with that said, right now what I'm doing is I am getting ready to solder the terminals back together. I already have my heat shrink off to the side here and ready for this. The reason we're doing it this way is that way we don't have a bunch of wires all inside the engine bay of this car. We kind of keep this as very clean as possible with minimal of overwhelming stuff inside the engine bay. Okay, so the throttle positioning sensor is now all soldered in. Okay, my heat shrink sitting up here. Once it's cooled down, I'll slide it over it. Then I'll shrink those on over and it'll be a perfectly good connection. This motor was built a long time ago and it sat on the shelf until we were able to get back around to this car. When I mean a long time ago, I mean years. There's something about having an honest, clean, simple performing twin spark motor that somehow still captures the nostalgia of the earlier car. I mean, nowadays you actually can get a modified 8 spark plug distributor. Not that I would ever advocate a distributor over an electronic ignition system, but there's just something about the idea of having that simple mechanical purpose still in play on a vintage car. Okay, so the crank triggering mechanism, that is sensitive to radio frequency interference issues. So if you ever have to cut one of these open, you're going to see there's foil wrapping around the wires. That's a frequency diverter. So though we have made our repair, okay, I cut this so I can get it through the firewall without having to make a big hole for these. And I have soldered on the new connections, and then I put a heat shrink over them to protect them. And then take some aluminum foil and I wrapped it around the repair as to protect that area that was exposed from frequency interference. And then we put heavy gauge heat shrink over the top of it. Okay, so this one's done. Now this one, again, I'm not exactly a big fan of this system here. This one, the wiring for the throttle position sensor, it wasn't even insulated. It just comes this way, loose 3 wires. So what I'm doing is I'm using some high rubberized electrical tape. This isn't the regular electrical tape you buy at a hardware store. This stuff has a great deal of rubber or elasticity to it. Okay, and it makes it very strong and makes it where it doesn't want to loosen up and move around as the car gets warm. Once I've done that, I'm not going to just stop there, because to me that's not a very finished look. We're going to go, and you'll see in a little bit, we're going to go back and we're going to use proper wire loom wrap to go over the top of this. Though you won't see this because it's all hidden under the intake, it's nice to know that it's very well protected, because this is really, really small gauge wiring. Alright, so now we have our highly rubberized electrical tape over our very small gauge wiring. This is a automotive grade electrical loom. This is really thick stuff, and what it does is it's just a spring experienced plastic, if you will. And what happens is as you wind it around, it kind of snugs the wiring very tightly. It also has a high heat resistance issue to it as well. This isn't the same cheap stuff you get at your automotive supply store, that split, cheap, paper thin, plasticky stuff. This is a real good stuff right here. So anyway, it takes a while to wrap it around, but once I'm done, that's how it's going to be, nice and clean. And that way, when we go to put this underneath and come back over the top for the throttle positioning sensor, It's going to be a nice, tucked away, clean, well-protected wiring system. When it comes to these advanced distributorless ignition systems, you always have to think all the way through them. Like I said before, this is a crank trigger. It is radio frequency interference influence stuff. In other words, if you don't protect it from, for example, the emissions of electronics coming off coil packs, spark plugs, it can actually foul the system to where it's not firing efficiently or firing at all. So again, if you have to cut this to bring it to the firewall, because we're hiding all the stuff on the inside to the exception of the coil packs, you're going to have to make sure that you protect it again with aluminum before you put the heat shrink over it and protect it. It's a bit hypocritical of me to say that I'm not a big fan of the system. I'm just not a fan of how they look in the engine bay on a vintage car. But with that said, here I have a really advanced system on my own car, but I'm running off a distributor. And I'll show you what I'm doing with that fairly soon. I have a trick that I'm doing to hide all the electrical components that are in my engine bay. All that state-of-the-art solid-state stuff just kind of confuses you when you're looking in the car with your vintage fill. So what I did is I bought a display automotive battery. My battery's in the trunk, but I bought a display model, hollowed out, and putting all the components inside that battery, and putting the lid back on top of it. So it looks like there's a battery sitting in there, and you won't know there's all the electrical components inside of it. Okay, so we're coming down to the final little things to take care of on my car before it is officially roadworthy after a 30-year slumber, if you will. Now, I've driven this many times on the streets and whatnot, but it's not registered and it was far from legal. Now we're coming to the end of that. There's only a few things left on my checklist. One, I need to tie in the oil cooler system from this really nice Alfa oil cooler radiator GTA replica setup. And other than that, the other thing we did is, if you remember in the beginning of this, you see me cutting out what is essentially the internals of the battery. Well, that was a display model. That is not a repurposed battery. You can find those, all online if you look hard enough. Anyway, so what we've done is we hollowed it out, and I put all my advanced electronics. As you can see, it looks like a battery, but it's actually where all my electronics are at. So essentially, that's how that's going to live. So now that that's done, the car runs just fine. I have a little bit of a hard idle issue. Now, you put that in conjunction with the motor smoking, you would think there's probably something wrong. Well, in fact, there is not. What I have is I have a failed brake booster problem. And what's going on is all the fluid's getting sucked out of the reservoir, into the booster, and eventually trickling in on the number 4 cylinder, which is giving me my smoking. As you can see, this is a brand freaking new brake booster, but it's been sitting on a shelf waiting for me to install it for a very long time, and they deteriorate if they're not used. So this is not an uncommon problem. I fix this, I no longer have a bizarre idle issue, and I will no longer have a smoking issue. If you have a mystery brake fluid leakage, but you don't see it in the brakes, you don't see it in the master cylinder, odds are your booster's starting to fail on you. So it's just something to think about. I'm going to pull this out and you'll see this thing is going to be chock full of fluid. So we have the rebuild kit for this on its way. I have the oil lines and the sandwich for the radiator and the oil cooler on the way. And at that point, it's time to get driving. Alright, so we're almost down to getting everything out of here. So now I'm taking the vacuum line off. Well, I can tell you right now, it's absolutely what I thought it was going to be. I can see residue in there from brake fluid. So it is completely collapse on the line, and it's pulling it right on through onto number 4, which again, this isn't my first rodeo. I knew it was going to be the case. Now, with that said, we've actually bought cars from people relatively cheap because they thought the thing was on its last leg because it was smoking, and it turned out it was exactly what we have here. And we go back to them and let them know the motor wasn't bad, it's not smoking for no reason, it was smoking because of this. And we've given them either A, the opportunity to buy the car back, or B, we paid a little bit more for the car, as to be fair. And we're out in the way. This is the vacuum section of the booster. This thing should be bone dry, it should never ever be anything in there. I already have evidence of brake fluid being in there. So by the time we get this apart, this thing's going to get quite full of brake fluid. And remember, brake fluid is highly corrosive, so don't do this on the car or near the car unless you want your paint destroyed. And you can see fluid pouring out of it already. That, my friends, is an awful lot of brake fluid. Okay, once again, excuse the noise, kind of jamming out while I'm putting my stuff together. The other day, I was doing an engine break-in. You may have heard in the video behind it a little bit of a chirping sound that was coming from my motor. I kind of assumed that was just the belt squealing, and it wasn't the belt at all. So we had to find out where it was coming from. And lo and behold, the head to intake gasket had a rupture in it. I'll show you what that looks like. Here it is. Now, mind you, this motor's been put together for a very long time, but this gasket had broken, and what was happening is water from the jackets were pulling into the carbs just a little bit. But most of what was really going on was I was getting a lot of air, so we flutter and sound like a kazoo, for lack of a better term, when it was running. So anyway, so we had to pull it off, and we discovered something. Through the midst of putting this motor together, we never upsized the intake to a 45 millimeter. There's no point in running 45 carbs if you don't have 45 air passages all the way into the valve. Don't confuse that with the chokes and with the velocity stacks. Your velocity stacks are typically the same size as the diameter of the throat of the carburetor, which would be a 45. But the chokes, which are just behind that, are typically choked down to the air needed to compress through the carburetor. But once it's past the carburetor and that fuel and air is mixed and everything's atomized, it needs volume to make performance happen. So we found out these are actually 40s. The head's 45, the carb's 45, but if my intake's a 40, I'm basically running a marathon with a straw taped over my mouth. So anyway, so we don't have that gasket problem again. What I did is I used some gasket former, coated it on there, letting it sit up for a few minutes, and then I'm gonna place this on there. By the way, when I cut all these down to 45s, which means you have to grind them with a proper aluminum burring grinder, and then you have to sand those out. You don't necessarily have to polish. There's a lot of arguments whether the intake should be polished or not. Does it affect performance in certain situations? Of course it does. But in order for air to turbulate a little bit and get a little bit of disruption to really help that air-fuel mixture flow on a normal street car, it's not bad to have that semi-rough of the surface, okay? If you polish it, yeah, you get extremely fast-flowing air through the intake. But in this case, I don't need all that because I'm not sitting at 8,000 RPM. So anyhow, we honed those out to 45. These are 45 on the gasket. And as you can see, the gasket is perfectly lined up with the ports now. So I'm gonna let this set up for a few minutes, then I'm gonna coat this side, and then I'm gonna mate it back onto the actual motor. And while that's setting up, I'll show you what our experience was. When the motor was running, we could hear this chirping sound. We thought it was the belt, but it turned out not to be. We opened up the cam cover and we started looking at the lobes of the cam, seeing if we had any excessive tightness on the cam to the cam follower locations, and everything's fine in there. So what we did is we took all the plugs off, and we started putting the plug in each hole and see if we could replicate the noise. And lo and behold, when we got to number 2, we could hear it again just by hand cranking the motor, okay? So we started the process of elimination. We opened the throttles wide open and tried it again, and nothing happened. So we knew that it had to be an air required issue. So anyway, so we took the carb off, moved it back and forth again. The sound came back only when we put tape over the intake, so we realized it was sucking air in somewhere else. That's how we were able to conclude. I'm happy that's what it turned out to be, because had it been a bent valve or something, oh boy, this close to driving would have been a problem. Okay, I want to bring you up to speed on 3 different things. 1, the booster, and this is now rebuilt and put back together. And 2, we were able to source the problem with the fluttering sound that was coming from the number 2 cylinder, which was coming off of the gasket, as I explained. And the carburetors are completely dialed in. We found out, and honestly never really trust a carburetor rebuilder, we found out there's a few things that weren't quite right with the carburetors. We found out that my air correctors were way too small. We were running lean on the top end. But anyway, so with that said, this thing is effectively more or less done. But we do have a little bit of a squeak sound still. But that squeak sound is now completely different. It is now the belts. So other than that, which is just a matter of aligning the alternator a little bit better, it's a real thing. This thing is just about at the end of its build life. Now, a lot of you are always very suspect or don't approve or really don't understand the value of a really hot ignition system. And you know that everything's stuffed underneath here. Something for you to consider. I have my hand on the headers right now. This car is bone cold. I have not touched this motor in 2 days. One thing about a nice, well-designed ignition system with timing and all the other things you can do with them is you can always have good, reliable starts. Now, this car has not been pumped on the gas, nothing's happened. I'm going to show you how one of the true advantages of having such a nice, hot ignition system. As you can see, stone cold motor, didn't have to pump the gas, didn't have to crank on it, it fires right up. That is a real value of it. Not to mention all the additional performance levels you get from a good design system. Now we're on to the GTA replica that we're building. This has become one of the most complicated cars in the world, it seems like. Down here we have the Electromotive Tech 3 engine control system. Okay, this is effectively an engine management system. And it's getting wired into our fuse panel. With that said, we are installing that. That is part of a very complicated system getting even more complicated. This is a Viper complete control system. What this is going to do is we're going to be able to have remote starting of this car. The key fob has a tack on it, so you can literally warm up the motor, rev the motor from your keys from in your house. It has keyless entry, and because we have keyless entry on the trunk, we're working off solenoid there, all these things are kind of relevant. We had to wire in our own design of a keyless entry for the trunk because the original remote system that went with the keyless entry wasn't going to jive with this. So there's all sorts of things we have to think of. But I want you to think about everything getting tied into this. We have our Electromotive engine management system. We have a complete alarm system with a lot of extras associated with it. We have also the control system for our very advanced speedometer slash telemetry system that gets wired into this. Plus we're going to have an amp back here, the battery's back here, and there's a few other items that are going back here. This is getting very, very full of electronics. And by the way, when we do something like this, we never want to use spade connectors and butt connectors and the other thing. We prefer to solder everything we can, because over time those things do soften up and loosen. And I would hate for somebody to have to go in here and try to figure it out once we're done building this. Okay, now on to this project for an update. This is the car that we're starting to route our own spark plug wiring system, because they don't want to use a store-bought one, mostly because it was unusual lengths that we were going to need, so we made our own spark plug wires. Now this car is very similar in a sense to the GTA project, that it also has an engine management system to it, but it's under the dash. And it's important where you locate those things, because they have a computer interface where you have to eventually tie them to your laptop to do some basic programming on it. In that car, we have it where the back seat used to be, because that's where all that high-tech stuff is. And this one, because we use a little more functional car, we have it underneath the dash, but also in a very easy location for you to plug in your computer. So if you're going to elect to do something like this, seriously think about where you put the electronics, because one, they can be sightly if you put them all in here, and two, for serviceability purposes, you want to be able to work on them with relative ease. As you get older, these things really count.
To all you sinners, you can sin at home, you can sin alone, you can sin on phone, you can sin on